Okay, good evening, everybody, and you're all very, very welcome to this, the fifth and sadly final lecture of the 2025 Dante Public Lecture Series here at University College Cork. And what better way, I think, to finish off with our very own Dr. George Rayson. Now, George is known to many of you online and also here in this room. Such, I think, has been the impact of his presence here since he arrived back in September. George completed a BA in English at the University of York, and it was there at the University of York that George began to take courses on Dante, and was indeed inspired by a friend of the centre, Professor Kenneth Clark. And this initial, if you like, encounter with Dante was such that George essentially changed career trajectory and decided to focus in on Dante. And with that in mind, he went to the University of Cambridge, where first of all he completed an MPhil in European languages, and then he did a rather excellent PhD thesis on the hapax, something you're going to hear an awful lot about this evening. So he did this PhD on the hapax in Dante's Commedia under the supervision of Professor Heather Webb, another friend of the centre. So subsequently, George applied and won a Research Ireland postdoctoral fellowship here at UCC, where he's working on transforming his PhD into a monograph. And I should also say that tonight's lecture is also part of the kind of wider school initiative that we have of these talks being delivered by postdoctoral researchers in the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures. And so this is the penultimate one of those, but the final lecture of the Dante series. The title of his talk this evening is Wasting, Waiting and Waiting. The importance of choosing the right words in Dante's Commedia. So please join me in welcoming George. Yep.
Thank you very much, Dara, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everyone in the Italian department at UCC and beyond as well, everybody in Cork. I've not been here for very long, but I've been made to feel really at home, so thank you so much, I really appreciate it. And also thank you for coming today, and to people online. The talk will last an hour, so if that's your attention spans are up for it, I'm just gonna throw that out there. So, without further ado, today's lecture is about why poetry is pleasurable and whether that is significant for Dante. How do words create pleasure for us, and how can we describe the effects Dante's words have on us? Can we make criticism out of it? How do we square feeling poetry and thinking about poetry? It seems quite an obvious point, and critics often return to it, but the Commedia is poetry. It is not a theological tract. The work privileges difference, plurality, and avoids simple categorization. What this lecture aims to show is that poetic pleasure and pleasure in the poetic word is something that preoccupied Dante too. How can we externalize the process of responding to poetry such that it is not just an infinity of subjective responses? One of the main ways I'm going to do this is to look at the phenomenon of hapax legomena, words which are only used once in the Commedia. Hapax are significant, singular crucibles of meaning, which also demand laser-like focus on the parts of readers. They also exemplify the plurilingualism, the variety of language in the Commedia. With this seeming contradiction between singularity and plurality, as I will demonstrate, hapax give us invaluable insights into how word choice is central to how the Commedia functions. If it seems that hapax are rather an abstract or random technique onto which to put so much emphasis, perhaps this might clarify things. So, the Professor of Poetry at Oxford, A.E. Stallings, has released a wonderful collection of poetry called Hapax, and this is the preface. And I wasn't aware of this collection when I was writing my thesis, but it would have actually been extremely helpful had I known about it. So look at how, according to this, if you go down to the second bit, the first use of the word hapax is in the Odyssey, as Circe explains that Odysseus' journeying into the underworld alive is unique, is hapax. Descending into the underworld while still alive is hapax. The Commedia is hapax. Stallings has also given a really quite wonderful lecture, and I would urge you to watch it if you get the chance. In it, she talks about how poetry is a negotiation between work and play, having fun and being serious, free association and discipline. It is a game, but that does not stop it being important. And as a mechanism for exploring this, she focuses on word choice, how an individual word can raise the stakes. Stallings' examples are all drawn from modern English lyric verse, and of course the Commedia is medieval Italian epic, so that means as a methodology, certain things would need to be adapted. The regularity of the structure of the Commedia means that there is a program of careful selection of words. I would not be the first person to suggest that every word in the Commedia has been carefully planned and selected in advance. There are also more than 2,000 hapax in the Commedia, and not all of them are going to be of quite the same significance. And that is why I want to think about hapax as more of a compositional practice, a method, rather than isolated sites of interest. So this lecture will be in 3 parts, each focused on one of those alliterative W words, and each of which is the theme of the Commedia, which activates the self-reflexivity of the poem, specifically with regards to how and why specific words are chosen in the composition of the work. I'm going to start by doing 2 slightly annoying things, one of which is start from the third one rather than the first one, and choose an example that isn't exactly pleasurable, I would say, or that kind of fights against poetic pleasure. And that is the Canto 13 of the Paradiso, which is particularly preoccupied with leadenness, with keeping our feet firmly on the ground. Paradiso 13 is not a particularly beloved canto. In fact, Anna Maria Chiavacci Leonardi declares that were it not for la breve ma grande apertura teologica on creation in the canto, it would be forse più povero come qualità inventiva e drammatica di tutta la cantica. This relative neglect or antipathy is rather unwarranted. Aesthetics aside, what really makes Paradiso 13 stand out is that it offers probably the most important practical manifesto in the Commedia for the significance of word choice in poetry. Here, Thomas Aquinas has just finished qualifying his statement that other than Solomon, there never arose another created being of the same wisdom, a statement problematized by the existence of Adam and Christ. The theological content of this argument aside, what interests me is how here at the close, Aquinas reflects on faulty argumentation with particular emphasis on how words are chosen and interpreted. The 2 uses of distinzione are tied to a lexicon of speech. Firstly, Dante character must take, prendi, Thomas's speech, while bearing the latter's distinction in mind. And in the second case, Thomas refers to the idiocy of those who, without distinction, afferma e nega, 2 verbs which reference acts of speech. Beyond being simply an issue of speech, however, Robin Kirkpatrick argues that the thrust of Thomas's focus on distinction is fundamentally a lexical one, where a speaker must be aware of the, and I quote, conditions under which his words are produced, and therefore, and I quote, the impress of that awareness would for Dante have been an evident caution in the use and interpretation of words. So far, so unsexy. But, as Kirkpatrick then argues, the very leaden-footedness of the poet is itself the ground from which his exhilaration securely rises. So instead of spontaneity of delivery, Dante makes his images with scientific particularity, concordant with the discipline advocated for by Thomas. This leads to Kirkpatrick concluding that because Dante's images are, in the end, only a convention for the truth, it encourages one to approach them as the enacting of an intellectual ludus. So just to unpack that, the careful, weighed-down approach to language advocated for by Thomas is an enactment of a certain pleasure, albeit one freighted by the impositions of an austere disciplinarian, but a pleasure nonetheless, which is activated by the knowledge that language cannot approach God anyway, hence the intellectual ludus, a knowing game of signs operating under the knowledge of never consummation. Then you might respond, surely, why does it matter individual word choice? If we can't get God right anyway, why does it matter individual that we focus on any specific word? Well, sure, but the point is that this is a willing stylistic choice on the part of the poet to show us something. And ultimately, this is what I want to draw your attention to in this lecture. Style and word choice and the pleasures to be found therein are not simply to be dismissed as a matter of style. If it's a bit, then it's a bit that Dante commits to wholeheartedly through Thomas in Paradiso 13. And there is certainly a sense that the canto seems to resist the eros of poetic invention with its consistent rumination on worsening, debilitation, moderation, leadenness, exhaustion, idiocy, binding, distortion. Thomas's syntax is frequently bound in negativity, as well as including 2 entire terzine at the bottom there on the kinds of wisdom Solomon did not ask for from God. Dennis Turner draws a comparison between the style of Aquinas, the real one, and while this is an important distinction, it should be noted that there is a long critical tradition of assimilating Dante's Aquinas and the writings of the real thing, and Dante's near exact contemporary, the German theologian Meister Eckhart. Turner contrasts the neurosis of Meister Eckhart with slow, leaden-footed Thomas in Paradiso 13, who, and I quote, knowing that we will never get God right finally anyway, seems less anxious, hence an unstrained, technical, but demotic ordinariness of speech is all as right. As Kirkpatrick says, the thrust of Thomas's speech is to, and I quote, concentrate attention on the ways in which we think and conduct ourselves within a world of brevi contingenze, of time and decay, of growth and change. Anxious, striving, straining, or slow, plodding, methodical. And here is where that line, brevi contingenze, appears in the canto. 2 of the 3 uses of the word contingenze in the poem are here. I think the notion of contingency strikes at the heart of what is important in the canto and might explain why word choice is not to be dismissed as just a matter of style, because what is contingent is not just everything created in the universe. There is not just ontological contingency, but epistemological contingency too. That is, what is contingent is also how we approach knowing, and knowing through language, in interpretation or rational argumentation. Returning to lead, what does Dante say? E questo ti sia sempre piombo a piedi, per farti mover lento come con buon lasso, e al sì e al no che tu non vedi. Al sì e al no. What are sì and no doing here? To what are this yes and no responding? They are not saying yes or no to anything in particular. They represent the acts of saying yes and no themselves, and are haunted by the vulnerability of utterance in the face of inscrutable contingency. These are 2 words which represent the putting out of language into the world. But there is also a sense that si and no are at one remove from the prevailing embodied poetry of the Commedia. They are mere representations, or as elsewhere in Aquinas' speech, as Dante has as a style that's employed in these cantos, a recourse to citation, whether that's auto-citation or citation for, or kind of a ventriloquization of what somebody might say, or in anticipation of what somebody will say. I would also just like to note that that verb impinguare, impingua, to fatten, which is used in Paradiso 10, is then only otherwise used in the Commedia in these 2 auto-citations from Thomas. And I would like to posit the question, and if anyone has an answer, I would be very pleased to hear it. Does that make impinguare a hapax legomenon? Bonaventure also has a couple of examples if you want to make this kind of citational poetics a mark of the style of these cantos rather than a mark of character, and that's in Paradiso 12. And then we have Thomas's ventriloquizations. With Chiedi, which is God's word to Solomon, and Surse, which is Thomas's word of Solomon, our attention is firmly drawn to the individual word. Even that al Surse, the al combination of preposition and definite article, shows how Surse has been turned into a noun. The word Surse has become a tangible object, ripped from its original context, and brought to heel in the distinctive rationality of Thomas's argumentation. The significance of contingenze in this canto is that it is a medieval prefiguration of our postmodern notion of difference. And much ink has been spilled on differential Dante, how Dante's plurilingualism in the Commedia is an exposure of the fundamental mutability and instability of human language. We will return to it in greater depth later, but the sì or no of Paradiso 13, to me, acts as in anticipation of the axiomatic passage of human language in Paradiso 26. Opera naturale è che uom favella, ma così o così natura lascia poi fare a secondo che va bella. Così o così. Similarly to sì and no, the phrase così o così is a representation of choice in language rather than presenting actual options. This is a self-reflexive moment as the poetry takes a step back and thinks about the process of word selection itself. And I'm taking some liberty with my syntax here, with the poem being the subject of the verb to think, to take a step back. Is the poem cognizant? Is it alive? Can it do? This question of the living body of the poem is also activated by the physical enunciation of the words. The poem lives and breathes through its living, breathing readers. And even if così or così does not present two actual choices, and as such is a self-reflexive commentary, I've always found the phrase to invite physical enunciation and physical enunciation of difference. Così or così. Is the one così exactly the same as the other? Technically, no. As the hendecasyllabic line pushes forward, one is never precisely the same as the other. One word is never precisely the same as the other. While così or al sì or al no do not present distinct choices in language, they perform the uncontrollable messiness of a poetic language that results in difference even in repetition. There is perhaps no more stirring example of this messiness than in the above passage, where we have a rima equivoca, that is a rhyme between two words that look and sound the same but mean different things, between pare, which is a hapax in its noun form and means equal, and the third person singular present tense form of the verb parere, to appear. Dante is clearly intrigued by the homophony between pare and parere, and therefore by the potential semantic cross-contamination between notions of equality and how things appear, essentially what a rima equivoca is itself. The repetition of the verb parere in line 91, paia, pare, only strengthens the idea that Dante is trying to tease out the full gamut of meanings which this homophony might present. And as K.P. Clark has beautifully demonstrated in his vertical readings of the cantos 10, all rima equivoca invite intricate parsing, but nowhere, perhaps, is that process thematized as here. In line with the unity of form and content in the canto, Dante does not just describe the importance of distinctions, he provides a hermeneutic challenge which invites such work to be completed. Not only is pare a hapax in the canto, but so is the adjective impari, which Thomas uses as he defines Solomon's wisdom. Onde, se ciò che io dissi è questo note, regala prudenza e quel vedere impari, in che lo stral di mia intenzione percuote. It is Solomon's unequaled seeing which defines his regal prudence. This definitive line is brought into high relief by the three hapax which mark its key terms. Regale, prudenza, and impari. In fact, impari is not only used just once in the poem, but its only attestation in contemporary Italian literature is in the Commedia. Impari really is out on its own, and the differential quality of hapax is harnessed in Paradiso 13 to express difference itself. Read together, impari acts as a tonic to the potential ambiguity of pare, as Thomas has led us from a point where we are still to some degree mired in confusion, to the definitive axiomatic statement of Solomon's singularity. The prefix im acts very literally to undo the homophonic ambiguity of the word pare. I think we can characterize this singular word, this hapax impari, which bespeaks a singular being, Solomon, as an attempt at fixity, of stability, against the messiness of the rima equivoca. Thomas's fascination with the individual word, precisely chosen, is an attempt at some fixity against the flow of plurilingualism. The tone is set for such a negotiation, in fact, from the outset of the canto, as the poem's narrative voice arrests the reader's attention. Immagini chi bene intender culpe, quel che or vidi, e ritegna l'image, mentre che io dico, come ferma rupe. Dante opens a canto with two hapax in the first rhyme pair, which only happens on 5 other occasions, which are here. But unsurprisingly, upe is a unique rhyme in the poem, yoking together the verb cupere, whose only attestation in contemporary Italian literature is here in the Commedia, meaning to desire, and the noun rupe, whose first attestation in the literature is also here, which means that's a fancy word for rock. Such striking singular language couples the reader's desire to understand with the firm fixity of a rock, here used to tether the reader's imagination. Dante uses two hapax in rhyme together, a fragile contract of singularity, to connect the process of reading, cupe, with the fixity of a rock, rupe. As with impari, succeeding the pare, equivocal equality, the hapax are there to provide some weight, some security. Thomas's work of distinction is a process aimed towards some stability of word, but which is constantly working against the flowing tide of linguistic difference. In short, Thomas's emphasis on distinction is about controlling what words do, with the knowledge of the difficulty, if not impossibility, of this task humming behind the canto's hapax. Distinction, the citations, the nounifying, cutting, and sticking of individual words. The weight of words is the technique Dante's Thomas presents us with for dealing with contingency, whether that's the inescapable fluidity of language or whether an unsayable, unapproachable God. Our conclusion should not, however, be that this is all a pointless word game, never to be consummated. Dante shows us how hard it is to work with words. Thomas says that we must move com uom lasso, as a weary man. This sense of debilitation seems to be preoccupying Dante, particularly in connection to contingency and the production of art and art through words. Thomas explains that difference in the universe is caused by lesser, deficient making, where la natura la dà sempre scema, similemente operando all'artista che l'abito dell'arte a man che trema. Difference in content and difference in form. Language is always unstable because it is a product of faulty human reason. Dante then uses faulty human processes to explain the differences in the matter of the universe itself, the trembling hand of a divine artificer, a demiurge. In the very words of the poem, debilitation is the point. We have to be weary, otherwise we're not doing it properly. The toxic workplace environment of the poem factory is also the place where hope germinates. We cannot talk about debilitation in the face of contingency without turning to a passage of the Commedia which has been most diligently carved into our collective memories, the opening of Paradiso 25. Se mai continga che il poema sacro al quale ha posto mano e cielo e terra, sì che m'ha fatto per più anni macro, vinca la crudeltà che fuor mi serra del bello ovile ov'io dormio agnello, nimico ai lupi che gli danno guerra, con altra voce ormai, con altro vello, ritornerò poeta, e in sul fonte del mio battesimo prenderò il cappello. This expression of hope, of a homecoming in the face of seemingly impossible odds, is a marker of the debilitating difficulty that contingency imposes on the body. The making of the Commedia, the weight of the enterprise, has made the poet per più anni macro, has pared his body away, has starved his physical faculties. This is at once an anguished realization of the flimsiness of a poetic enterprise. What has it all been for if the material fact of my homecoming remains so far out of reach? But it is also an exhilarating marker of survival, an inscription that says, I am here and behold my works, even against such impossible odds. Se mai continga. Contingere is a verb which already expresses contingency, but in the phrasing here, it is also in the subjunctive mood, a grammatical means of expressing contingency, a hypothesis. The stakes are raised even further by the fact that contingere is not used anywhere else in the poem. It is a hapax. After using contingente twice, and as we have seen, contingenza 3 times, Dante chooses this moment alone to use the verb contingere. The firmness of this lexical choice makes a continga a decisive statement, even as it is doubly freighted with contingency. Perhaps this is the most important hapax of all. A hapax is evidence of linguistic difference, the disorganization and messiness of human language in enterprises, but it is also a decisive, singular choice, a statement of here-ness, of survival against the odds. Now, I'm going to proceed to discuss how Dante reflects on such firmness and fixity, and the title of this part is a slight misnomer because it concerns more the temporal organization where attendance and attention are directed. So really attention or dalliance would have been better, but they wouldn't have been alliterative, would they? And it wouldn't have sounded as nice. So to introduce this, I'm going to return to the word piombo, lead. The use of piombo, leaden words, tend to be rather pragmatically descriptive in the Commedia, usually describing the backing to a mirror, which is how mirrors were made in the medieval period, at glass with a backing of lead, or the heavy suits worn by the hypocrites in the 6th Bolgia of the 8th circle of Malebolgia, represented in Inferno 23. And then, yes, this is the mirror in Paradiso 2, and it's worth noting, given that it's fundamentally because of difference that Thomas counsels leaden feet, that this, Paradiso 2, is the canto in which Beatrice uses Dante's question about the spots on the moon to provide a full cosmological breakdown of the nature of the universe, including how the different planets, each with its own distinction, affects what happens on Earth below. So those are the 3 uses of the noun piombo in the poem, but then we also have the verb piombare over on the right-hand side. And again, the first one is quite pragmatically descriptive, as the ridge overlooking the 3rd Bolgia hangs exactly at its center, like a pendulum. But then also in Inferno 23, in the bottom right, we have the verb piombare, but used in the sense of the mirror, but rather less literally than in Paradiso 2. Dante and Virgil have just escaped the Malabranche devils who have been left squabbling in the previous canto/Bolgia. Dante fears their impending reappearance, to which Virgil responds, "E quei, se fossi di piombato vetro, l'immagine di fuor tua non trarrei piuttosto a me che quella dentro un petro." And there's a nice little pun there with that impetro. Here it means to grasp, or more literally to obtain via prayer, but the verb impetrare is also used to mean to turn to stone on a couple of occasions in the poem. Think again of the coupe and rupe at the start of Paradiso 13, where after grasping something, understanding it, you must then fix it, petrify it internally. So what Virgil is saying here is that even if he were leaded glass, i.e. a mirror, he would not be able to capture Dante's outer image as quickly as now he captures Dante's inner fear. The fact that there is this use of a lead word that does not directly describe the leaden cloaks of the souls of the hypocrites in the Bolgia shows that Dante poet has lead on the brain in the composition of this canto. And I think by introducing a lead word here, leaden glass, rather than simply a mirror, Dante is teeing up the associations that will follow in Paradiso. More specifically, look at the knottiness of that simile in the bottom right. It takes some careful thinking about. That tightly boundedness is not just in the form of the simile, but also its content. It is telling us that there is a deep understanding of Dante's interior life on the part of Virgil, to the degree that it is as close as the sameness between an original and its reflection. Now, for this section, I'm going to be mostly doing a sort of vertical reading of the openings to the cantos 23 of the Commedia. And this simile, on the bottom right, that we've just seen, is kind of nothing in terms of its knottiness in comparison with that used at the start of the canto of Inferno 23. Voltaire in sulla favola di Isopo, lo mio pensier per la presente rissa, dove il parlò della rana e del topo, che più non si pareggia mo e issa che l'un con l'altro fa, se ben s'accoppia principio e fine con la mente fissa. Now this will take some parsing. Having watched the scuffle between the devils, where the two grapple in the air before falling into the pitch below, Dante's mind jumps to the Aesop's fable of the frog and the mouse, who similarly each try to kill the other in crossing a river, and then are both swept up by a hawk from above. Now, the words mo and issa are both regional variations of words meaning now, and Dante's narrator tells us those two words, meaning the same thing, are not more similar than the two tales, Dante's of the devils and Aesop's of the frog and the mouse, if you regard the structure of the tales, the beginning and the end, with a fixed mind. And while there are many calls to the reader in the Commedia, I'm struggling to think of any others where the reader is asked so explicitly to pay attention to how texts are structured. This is Dante, a formalist. So there are numerous entanglements at play here. The two devils are closely entwined, the frog and the mouse. Those two tales are closely entwined, as are the words mo and issa. And then you could extend those multiple entanglements to the reader, who, like Virgil, grasping Dante's inner fear, once they grasp what the simile is, grasp the truth of the comparison with their dedicated, diligent mind. The fixity and diligence of this reader find their antitype in the figure of Dante at the start of Purgatorio 23. In fact, all three cantos 23, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, all begin with a figure who is fixed in attention. In the case of Purgatory 23, this figure is paying too much diligence. And this Dante's overzealous watching is likened to another activity which, as many of you may know in the room and online, is close to my own heart, that of bird watching. After hearing a mysterious voice proclaim examples of abstinence from within the foliage of a bush at the end of Purgatory 22, at the start of our canto, Dante is searching amongst the leaves for the source of the voice. Mentre che gli occhi per la fronda verde ficcava io, siccome far suole chi dietro agli uccellin sua vita perde. Lo più che padre mi dicea, figliuole, viene oramai, che il tempo che ne è imposto più utilmente compartir si vuole. Dante compares his search for the source of the voice to one who loses his life after the little birds. Indeed. Now, Sterling and Martinez note that this is usually taken for fowling, where hunting small birds with nets and birdlime was a popular sport in the Middle Ages, and not, like falconry, restricted to the nobility. If fowling or birding was not an elite activity, then this more accessible form of leisure keys into the mood of Purgatory 23, which in Rinaldino Russell's words is a mood of friendly and trusting human exchange. Virgil's admonishment has an easygoing, paternal character to it, even as Dante computes his reflection on wasted time into the narrative organization of the poem. Il tempo che ne imposto più utilmente compartir si vuole. Now, just as a brief sidebar, just to kind of expand on this notion of hobbying, I'm going to bring in an example from A.E. Stalling's lecture, which is Robert Frost's Two Tramps in Mud Time, which Frost called a poem against hobbies. And I'll just read to you from the final stanza. But yield who will to their separation. My object in living is to unite my avocation and my vocation, as my two eyes make one in sight. Only where love and need are one, and the work is play for mortal stakes, is the deed ever really done for heaven and the future's sakes. We could say that Virgil's gentle chastising of Dante is his own poem against hobbies, where, even if it is gentle, Dante, poet, through Virgil, is clearly concerned with the structure of his poem. What narrative time is imposto? And that really is the key thing, linking at least the first two cantos 23, that Dante is keeping an eye firmly on poetic structure. The introduction of a popular hobby as a foil to correctly spent time introduces a negotiation between work and play that besets poetic structure, where a poet must decide what is in and what is out, what is good and what is bad poetic material, but also, crucially, reflects on the act of reading poetry, hobby or work. I mean, even the fact that the lofty Latinate principio and the stirring requirement to read with a mente fissa are applied to a story about a frog and a mouse, and more readily to two devils falling into goo because they were distracted by their own fight, should tell us that not everything is so severe. At the start of only one canto previously, Dante has dedicated a multi-tetzina mock epic simile to the description of a fart, turning the devil's arse trumpet into a militaristic clarion call. Are we then mistaken to be drawing too much attention to the mos and issas of the poem? Would Dante mock us, and I'm including all of you in this foolish enterprise as well? Would he mock us for chasing after trifling little words, as he does those who chase after the little birds? Purgatorio, especially, is the canto where how you spend your time is the most immediately pressing. The souls are in effect in a waiting room. It is the only canticle where souls and Dante character are subject to earthly time. Teodolinda Barolini argues in Dante's Poets that the simile at the start of Canto 23 anticipates Forese's final words in the following canto. Tu ti rimani ormai, che il tempo è caro in questo regno, sì che io perdo troppo venendo te così a paro. So we have this vertical repetition of pare and pare, now becomes a horizontal repetition of paro and paro, but they are both ways of deeply embedded spending time. Forese is enjoying himself too much in cleaving to Dante. The fun of their rekindled friendship must be reckoned with the purgatorial imperative to not lose time. As Barolini says, time is the essential commodity of the Purgatorio. Forese's precious time on his soteriological journey mirrors the deep concern of the Purgatorio at large, which is gripped by this incongruity between poetry as play and serious exigency. If words can be chosen for unserious purposes, if in chasing his words Dante is leading us astray, then what of the hapax? Surely these are all vital shibboleths which strike at the heart of Dante's poetic enterprise. I think Dante wants to keep things in moderation, and I think he is aware of the allure that words can possess, especially poetic words. Hapax are a great mechanism for exposing this because, oh, did I do something? Oh dear. È chiuso.
Yeah, it hasn't gone anywhere. Just bear with us a sec there, folks.
Everybody.
Where's it gone?
It's just Did I press something?
I have no idea. This is screen sharing, aren't we? Yeah. Wherever we were.
Oh, well, we can. Bit of revision for everybody. So, okay. And there we go. Okay. Everybody okay? You thirsty, hungry? Time is the essential commodity of the Purgatorio, as you can see. It's very essential commodity here as well. Forese's precious time on this soteriological journey mirrors. So I've done that actually. I've done all that actually. What am I talking about? Where was I? Yes. Dante is aware of the allure that words can possess, especially poetic words. Hapax are a great mechanism for exposing this because their singularity is very much arresting. Half the battle is won already. The word uccellino, for instance, the little birds at the start of Purgatorio 23, is a hapax, but is connected by Barolini to another diminutive hapax, pargoletta, in Purgatorio 31. Non ti dovere, as Beatrice admonishes Dante, non ti dover graver le penne giuso ad aspettar più colpo o pargoletta o altra novità con si breve uso. Barolini argues that the opening simile of Purgatorio 23 may be seen as an anticipation of Beatrice's Edenic rebuke. The vain pursuit of little birds finds its metaphorical equivalent in another distracting diminutive, the pargoletta of Canto 31. In this view, Dante makes the problem of vain and trifling pursuits a decidedly lexical issue. That diminutive language, especially when used on no other occasion, allures and immerses in moments of leisure and pleasure. Potentially the best dramatization of this stickiness of language, particularly of hapax, comes in Inferno 13, and also happens to involve the language of bird hunting. In what is a standard practice in Inferno, Virgil encourages Pierre de la Vigne in the wood of the Suicides, to give Dante his identity, so as that the latter can promulgate his story on earth. Ma di lì che tu fosti, sicché invece di alcuna menda tua fama rinfreschi nel mondo su, dove tornar li lece, il tronco, sì col dolce dir madeschi, che io non posso tacere, e voi non gravi perché un poco a ragionare m'inveschi. I'm drawn here to two verbs in rhyme, one of which is hapax, and the other whose hapax status is a bit dodgy, but where both are drawn from the language of catching animals, adescare and invescare. Adescare is definitely hapax in the Commedia, made from the word esca, meaning bait or lure. So Pierre says that with his sweet speech, Virgil lures him such that he cannot possibly be silent. Then we have invescare, which Hollander includes in his list of hapax in the Commedia, although there are three uses of the verb inviscare in the poem, which has a very similar, if not identical sense. The pitch, inviscava, the banks which contain it. The devils we were talking about earlier have their wings inviscate in the pitch, and then, as sometimes very excitingly happens, a very inferno word turns up in Paradiso, as before the crucial speech by the poet's forefather Cacciaguida in Paradiso 17, predicting Dante's exile. Here the narrator describes the clarity of Cacciaguida's speech. Ne per ambage, in che la gente folle già s'inviscava prima che fosse anciso l'agnel di Dio che le peccata tolle, ma per chiare parole e con preciso latin rispose quello amor paterno, chiuso e parvente del suo proprio riso. La contingenza, blah, blah, blah. Cacciaguida's prophetic speech is not mired in ambiguities. More on this later. It is clear that any orthographical variance that makes invescare different from these examples of inviscare is a matter of making the word conform to the rhyme. To compound the fact that invescare is not a hapax, there are multiple manuscript witnesses of these other examples of inviscare, which actually give invescare, particularly inviscate in Inferno 22, which in Petrarch's collation has 5 witnesses giving invescate and 2 invesciate. And then for inviscava in Paradiso 17, the Lawrenziana manuscript gives invesciava. Now, Petrarch obviously elects for inviscare in all of these cases, but there is certainly enough doubt to deter anyone from making a bold point about the singularity of invescare in Inferno 13, and actually helps us because it means we can make some more easily some cross-textual comparisons, as I will do now. So, Pierre says, let it not weigh on you, gravi, where weight is seen in this sense as here as an encumbrance or annoyance, that I bird-lime myself a little to stay. As we saw with coupe and rupe, where the idea must be captured and then made to stick, so Virgil's words lure Pierre to speak, and then the lime makes him stay. Although, of course, Pierre limes himself. And I love the doubling of subjunctives in rhyme. Gravi, let it not weigh you down, and then invesci, Pierre's captatio benevolentiae with dolce dir, well, if you insist, becomes let it not weigh on you, in a parody of courtly delicacy, and which acts as a gateway for the far stronger and more rarefied invesci. Pierre de la Vigne is serrando and disserrando the door of self-presentation, performing a negotiation between lexical daring and subjunctive hesitancy. The presentation of souls in the afterlife is often programmatic, subject to narrative exigency. The most frank exposure of this is in Inferno 32, where Dante grabs a soul by the hair and forces him to reveal himself. With this violence lurking behind the interaction with Pia, the interplay of subjunctives becomes a pageant, even a parody of courtly flattery, which is, after all, what condemned Pia to suicide. Returning to Inferno 23 and the fixed mind of the reader, who compares the fall of the devils with Aesop, such a reader would actually be quite a bad reader. How rich an analysis can be offered by a flat comparison of the beginnings and endings of two stories? The blandness of such a reading of Principio and Fine reflects Dante's consciousness of the brutality of narrative, its over-simplicity, which hides behind Pierre's lexical finery. When we are told that Cacciaguida is not enlivened by any ambage, we are brought back to the trappings of infernal language. Ambagia is a hapax in the Commedia and a first attestation in the vernacular, but is used by Dante in the De Vulgare Eloquentia, to which this usage in Paradiso is a likely reference. In the De Vulgare Eloquentia, Dante assesses the literary merits of each of the Romance languages, and he includes Arthurian romances in his praise of French prose works. As Hollander observes of Ambages, Dante probably found its most troubling presence in the Aeneid Book 6, where Ambages was used to typify the animal-like sounds of the cave-dwelling Sibyl's prognostications. But then Pierre Reiner shows that Ambage was also used by various Roman poets to describe the sinuous path of the Minotaur's labyrinth. The twists and turns of the labyrinth reverberate in the serpentine ambiguities of language. Ambage is the last hapax in the canto for more than 30 lines. In order to demonstrate argumentative clarity, Dante removes almost any hapax from Cacciaguida's speech. In this particular configuration, Dante is trying to release his language from the stickiness of hapax, from interesting language, which represents something material, almost animalistic, instinctive, something sticky which can trap the hearer in their most primitive state of being, like a bird trapped in lime, floundering for its life. So to finish this section, we're going to turn to the start of Paradiso 23, which also concerns birds. But this time, the figure in waiting is the mother bird herself, Beatrice. We have the mente fissa of Inferno 23, the occhi ficava in Purgatorio 23, and here the bird, viso guardando. Beatrice eretta e attenta, with Dante sospesa e vaga, ready in waiting. From Inferno 23 to Purgatorio 23 to Paradiso 23, we recede from the mind to the eyes to the whole body, standing to attention in anticipation of the triumph of Christ and the ascension of Mary, which will take place in the canto. What is everybody waiting for? Why is everybody standing to attention? In Inferno, we have the knotty interior tangles of an imagined reader caught in a web of allusion. In Purgatorio, we have Dante character himself, piqued by curiosity, but perhaps also trying to expedite a narrative revelation of character. Perhaps the person speaking might be of some significance. But here, in Paradiso, we have complete, unfettered devotional focus. The bird who does not have to concern itself with self-reflexivity or the entanglements of reading. It is simply waiting to work and work hard, but where such work is also deep pleasure. It has to be an animal who completes the set of those in waiting in the 23s, because it does not reflect, it does not think, it simply does. It is simply here, attentive. Now at this point, I would like to point out that I myself may be engaging in some oversimplified cross-textual comparisons to the tune of Paradiso good, Inferno bad. But there is plenty of messiness in Paradiso as well, and we'll look at that in more depth in the final section of the talk. But for a start, there is the confounding of pain and pleasure in the labours of the bird. In che gravi labori li sono aggrati, which brings to mind not only the pronouncement of labia mea domine, which is said with delight in Purgatorio 23, but also Forese's explanation of the contradictory experience of purgation in the same canto. Christ gladly, lieto, pronounces Eli, from Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Pain and pleasure are collapsed into that one word, Eli. That one word is then repurposed on one other occasion in the poem, in Adam's disquisition on the mutability of human language, and immediately after the Così o Così passage. Adam uses El as the example of linguistic change, the name for God in the time of Jesus, which was E at the start of creation in the Garden of Eden. The word El in the Commedia is therefore, as with si and no, and così or così, an isolated word which works as both a symbol, an axiom for linguistic difference, and in the mouth of Christ, and indeed in rhyme position of the poem, Eli, not El, materially activated. As such, I would encourage us to read the two El and Elis together as part of the weave of the poem itself, rather than as quotation or symbol. If we do that, then the Christological conflation of pain and pleasure is wired into the flow of linguistic change which underpins poetic creation. Pain and pleasure in Purgatorio are entwined because the pain of purgation will result in salvation. In Paradiso, it's less simple. But if we recall the exhaustion of the individual with their leaden-footed approach to speech, the emaciation of the poet after years of graft, and if we then think of the little bird, to whom hard work is light, and pleasure resides in that painful graft itself. Now, in the final section of the talk, I'm going to talk about how pleasure can be found in words, and whether that pleasure can be pushed too far. In modern Italian, when we want to talk about wasting time, we say perdere tempo. And this phrase is used on several occasions in the poem, but I make this point as a bridge to the final section of the lecture slightly flippantly, because that doesn't really work, because only in English, really, is there a pun between wasted time and waste, as in extraneous matter, excrement, etc. doesn't exist in Italian. However, there remains a conceptual link between the organisation, what is in and what is out, of how the poet and how we spend our time, and how a poet decides what is and isn't worthy matter for a poem. When it comes to what words Dante considers extraneous, the most obvious place to go is the De Vulgari Eloquentia, Dante's Latin prose text dedicated to the rightful composition of vernacular verse. As you can see, sorry, or not, there is a you don't have to read it all, okay, that's right. There's a multi-layered taxonomy of words here, separating the muliebra from the virilia, then within the virilia from the silvestria, from the urbana, then within the urbana, a separation of the pexa et lubrica, the irsuta et rebura, where the pexa and the irsuta are to be valorized. Dante then addresses us, the reader, intueraris ergo lector, to ensure we pay close attention in our work of sifting out the best words. Cribro, sieve. We'll come to later. Then after that, gives us examples of words to be excluded, and it has not escaped critical attention that certain words, particularly mamma and babbo, certain words that Dante lists here as inappropriate, he then uses in the Commedia. But then, of course, in the DVE, Dante is talking about noble, tragic poetry, and the Commedia does not exactly belong to this genre. Instead, as Albach famously argued, it is characterized more by a sermo humilis, a humble style, and therefore closer to sacred scripture. Another critical truism is that while the DVE is characterized by a fundamentally exclusionary approach to language, what is out and what is in, the Commedia is fundamentally generous when it comes to the types of words that it includes. In essence, a plurilingualism of come one, come all. Now, while on the surface this is true, that doesn't preclude the Commedia from exhibiting careful scrutiny or being deeply concerned with waste matter, even if we are forced to confront it rather than have it be submerged from our gaze. Nor, in fact, as Catherine Keane demonstrates, does it mean that the DVE is steadfastly authoritarian in its exclusions. Keane argues that the treaty's interest in connecting ideas about language and politics provides an element of comparability with the poem. I think this is particularly illustrative for my purposes because it forces us to think not of exclusion versus inclusion, but in the manner in which both texts deal with these issues. Remember Aquinas versus Eckhart. If the goal is out of reach, then form is everything. And this is really where hapax come in, because they are both and, not either or. They demonstrate a generous approach to language, that lots of different words from lots of different origins come together in the Commedia. But they also betray meticulous attention, show that despite this generosity, Dante's approach to words is not scattergun. If hapax invite us to pay careful attention, then we as readers become immersed in the world of the word. A troubling prospect when the comedy, and it is a comedy, represents obscenity, things that might not be worthy of poetic representation. In Inferno, we might expect such things, and indeed Dante recognises that there has to be a base enough language to match, as we see at length in the opening to Inferno 23. So when Dante finds the flatterers bathed in shit in Inferno 18, then it stands to reason that he used the word shit or shitty,
And he does. Vidi un col capo sì di merda lordo. Quella sozza è scappigliata fante che la si graffia con l'unghie merdose. Merdoso, the adjective, is actually a hapax, but merda is not, being reused in Inferno 28 in describing the guts of the mutilated souls. La corrata pareva il Cristo sacco che merda fa di quel che si trangugia. I would point out at this juncture that what Dante actually says is the sad sack that makes shit, which is an antonomasia, a moment of, albeit not particularly strong, rhetorical flair. In short, he works the word merda into the poem. It is not there just by necessity. And I'll briefly also point out that a similar thing happens, with the fart at the end of Inferno 22. Ed egli avea del cul fatto trombetta. And as Fabian Alfie explains, Dante goes out of his way to work the fart into his poem by using the pluperfect tense, avea fatto, to double back and add this detail after he has finished describing the narrative action 3 lines earlier in line 136. And then underlines the fart by dedicating the opening 12 lines to Inferno 22 to describing it. Again, this is simply not all by necessity. And this is worth bearing in mind for what I want to talk about to close the talk, which is the messiness of Paradiso, and how the third canticle handles waste matter, even making a virtue of it. If we are not necessarily surprised by the appearance of human waste in Inferno, then we should definitely be struck by how St. Peter describes the state of the contemporary papacy in Paradiso 27. Fatà del cimitero mio cloaca del sangue e della puzza. Cloaca and puzza here are hapax. Cloaca means sewer. And I would also point out that there is no verb puzzare in the Commedia, but there is apuzzare, also a hapax in Inferno 17, used to describe Geryon, the figure of fraud who makes the whole world reek of his stench. One thing that struck me was that alongside these very strong words, these hapax that verge on the obscene, Peter also repeats himself in a fit of passion. Il luogo mio, il luogo mio, il luogo mio. Now, it is not as if repetition is rare in the Commedia, not just of singular words, but of longer phrases such as this. But what I believe is unique is that this repetition is almost a prose-like concatenation. The luogo mio spills over from one line to the next, with Dante giving the impression that he is forgetting the limits of poetic structure. There is not enough time in this talk, but I would be interested to spend a little more time thinking about the relationship between rhetoric and waste. Where is the boundary line drawn between effective rhetoric and wasted words? When does repetition become filibuster? In any case, the word cloaca is not unique as a waste word in Paradiso. In the final canto of the poem, Bernardo uses the word lacuna to describe the pit of hell. Used only once in the Commedia, it is also attested in the language for the first time in the poem. From the Latin lacunam, Riccardo Viel says that its original Latin use was to mean water in a cistern or tank, and then a basin or lagoon of stagnant water. Early commentator Benvenuto da Imola is rather more expansive in his explanation of lacuna. For Benvenuto, the word is a rectam metaphoram for hell, firstly because of its concavity, but more because it collects and contains. Following Benvenuto's remark on stercora bullientia, boiling dung, Cesari also makes the link to excrement, saying that it is a ricettacolo o scollatoio d'acque morte, which nel concetto riuscirebbe a voler dire latrina. As a lacuna, hell becomes a latrine, a place of waste. I think what is significant about this word lacuna and cloaca is that they do not describe the viscera of human waste, but instead mechanisms, techniques of waste disposal. The message here being that in Paradiso, it is not that waste matter has disappeared, but that it is being processed, refined. Dante's choice to put the word in rhyme is highly significant, as are the words with which he chooses to rhyme it. If lacuna is the gathering place of all the world's ills, then in Mary, Dante meets in Paradiso 33, gathers ad una, all the world's goodness. In what is almost a rima equivoca, Dante rhymes ad una with ad una, as once again the poet uses words which sound the same but mean different things. Splitting Mary's union of goodness, Dante's journey is described as a series of meetings, la vita spiritale ad una, which comprises the poem, a series of meetings which comprises the poem, gathered together in the one meeting, which is arguably the most important of all. All the characters, the spirits of the Commedia, the content from hell to Paradiso are contained in Mary. It is worth remembering that the progress of the poem, as we saw in Paradiso 23, is marked by consistent reminders to not lose time. Each spirit, each meeting is significant, but each has its time. It is almost always after a meeting with another spirit in which Dante is urged not to lose time. While the poem's waste should be left behind in the lacuna of hell, there is still the matter of the final canto to process. The stillness or stagnancy which Dante must evince to commune with God, to be attentive, is also the stillness of spent time. Ronald Martinez remarks on the fact that, and I quote, the last 6 cantos of Paradiso inscribe numerous recapitulations of moments in the poem already traversed by the reader, and that, therefore, and I quote again, in both theological and formal senses, the end of the poem is its beginning. Such circularity suggests that what has already passed has not entirely left us, but still obtains in some way, even in the heights of the Empyrean. And lacuna serves as a reminder that even the poetry of the Empyrean has to unfold over time. It is still haunted by how to precisely organize its time in the right choice of words. Waste, however, is not just something that haunts. Dante shows us in Paradiso that there is value in experiencing that which is extraneous, which might be termed waste matter. We're going to return one more time to Paradiso 26, but not to Adam's disquisition on language. In the first half of the canto, Dante is blinded and undergoes an examination on caritas from St. John. This is how the return of Dante's sight is described. The word I want to focus on here is quisquilia, and already you can tell it is an absolute delight to pronounce. Probably my favourite word of them all, quisquilia. Quisquilia is a hapax in the poem, unsurprisingly, a Latin word which Chiavacci Leonardi translates as piccolezza bazzecola, that is a trifle, but in the context of its use in Paradiso means an eye blemish cleared from the pilgrim's sight by Beatrice. A more technical explanation comes from Benvenuto, who locates the word in a specifically agrarian context. Such specificity explains the fact that the word seemingly has only one, i.e. chaff from grain, so the chaff is in Dante's eye. Such specificity explains the fact that the word seemingly only has one attestation in vernacular Italian prior to the Commedia, in the vernacularization of Bartolomeo Anglico's De Proprietatibus Rerum by the Mantuan Vivaldo Belcalzer. It is not even used in the main body of the text, but as a rubricated heading, Capitol delle Quisquilia, after an, as Paolo Manni explains, ampia sezione del testo dedicate ad alberi e piante. As Manni argues, the attestation of Quisquilia in Belcalzer corroborates the sense of the word given by the Tilio, the Tesoro della Lingua. Oh God, I've forgotten the acronym. Somebody help me. Anyway, the Tilio, the nice database that we all know and love, which is the waste matter from the threshing of grains. Quisquilia is also, according to Hollander, a hapax in the Bible, used at Amos 8:6, and indicating the chaff from the grain, for the selling of which God admonishes the Israelites. This discovery embeds the word further in a technical language of agrarian labour, as it refers to a specific practice in meshing this material history of labour with the labour of the text. This is of a piece with another image in Paradiso 26, as the pilgrim's answers to John will be through a più angusto vaglio, a narrower sieve, where angusto and vaglio are also hapax in the Commedia. The sieve image that Dante applies to filtering out the best words in the DVE is also echoed here, where we are forced to reckon with the fact that Dante also applies a precision poetics in the Commedia. The word quisquilia is used in the context of Beatrice's bettering of Dante's sight, as the Encyclopedia Dantesca entry declares. The word is therefore used as part of Beatrice's labor limae, the work of the file, the Horatian context for Dante's frequent poetic labour in the Commedia, tempering and perfecting the sight of the pilgrim in preparation for what is to come. The careful labour also bespeaks a pleasure in the nuts and bolts of labour, something which Dante prized, and Carlo Mayet has written about Dante's fascination with and privileging of the technological advancements of his age. This is conveyed to us who have to do some hard graft, some etymological excavation to find out just what it means. It's not obvious. And yet for both of us, for both us and for Dante, there is something about the phonics of the word that speaks to us. The word invites pleasure, even in the formation of its very sounds. Manni says that the word is avvalorata e messa in rilievo dalla posizione in rima. The rhyme position of the word engages these phonic pleasures. And it is possible that, as this hapax catches our eye, or rather ear, on the page of the Commedia, it could also have jumped out as a strange and singular usage to Dante's ear in his reading of the Bible. He's more likely to find it in the Bible than in a random scientific text. The hapax status of a word thus forges a particularly potent covenant between poet and reader, as the effective responses of both are stimulated by the same singular word. The significance of quisquilia is that it is fundamentally a paean against necessity. In the context of its use, Dante has been engaged in a theological examination. But we already know he's going to pass it. This evasion of teleology finds its synecdoche in quisquilia. Every quisquilia is removed from Dante's sight, so his participation in heavenly joy can increase, but the word still lodges in our eyes. We can't quite rid ourselves of it. It is as much about the process as the result, a way of thinking which underwrites the lexicon of the Stilo della Lauda, and as such, Dante has to thank the quisquilia as much as be grateful for its departure. Quisquilia is not selected to directly communicate a present reality, rather it enriches an absent reality, that of when the blemishes were present. And in selecting it, the poet demands we read words not only for their communicative efficacy, but also for their phonic pleasures. Pleasure needs no explanation. It is immanent. And it is because of pleasure that a hapax forges that powerful, effective covenant between reader and poet. A hapax is also decidedly immanent. In a way, its singularity means that it says no more and no less than what it says. The importance of quisquilia is amplified by the fact that, through its shared rhyme, it interacts with another section of the poem with powerful reverberances throughout, the episode of Ulysses, in Canto 26 of Inferno. In a striking vertical correspondence, these two passages from identically numbered cantos of Inferno and Paradiso also share a rhyme that is unique to only these passages, the rhyme in Ilia. Such a vital shared commodity allows quisquilia to shoot its reverberances back down to hell. What is Ulysses doing here? He's using his rhetoric, his words, to achieve a particular goal, to convince his shipmates to accompany him on one last mission to the ends of the earth. Quisquilia is quite the opposite, always encouraging pleasure for its own sake, against necessity. And before we slip into a rigid palinode of Paradiso good, Inferno bad, as I hope to have demonstrated, messiness is everywhere. There is lexical seduction in Inferno as much as in Paradiso. The work of encouraging lexical pleasure is a fundamental constitutive principle of the entire poem. Thank you.
Oh, don't sit down, George. Thank you, George. That was really, really excellent, and it was a genuine kind of tour de force. I'm just going to. Where is my thing here? I'm going to stop sharing now. I'm going to open up for questions. So, for those of you online, if you'd like to just put up your hands if you have a question, I'll just start this off because that was a very, very dense paper, and there's a lot to mull over, but just kind of stepping outside of it a little bit, because you were alluding to it a little bit. You didn't spend a huge amount of time kind of giving it emphasis about, when the hapax is in the rhyme word in the position of the line. But I'm also interested in some of these cantos that you have a kind of a clustering of hapax. Are there areas of the poem where there's a complete absence of hapax? And what does that entail? Because hapax seems to me as something that is drawing attention to itself and drawing attention to the poetics of the poem, the poem's becoming. I'm thinking in particular about David Linda Baroline said in the Undivine Comedy, when she said, alongside the narrative journey of the protagonist, there's also the poetic journey, in which the poem's becoming is made evident in its language and its poetics. So I was wondering, is the absence of hapax a thing you considered?
Shall I stay up here?
Yes.
Yeah,
so I kind of alluded to it a little bit, but the most striking example for me is Paradiso 17, because it's almost an announcement of an absence of hapax. It's almost saying, I'm going to be really clear now. Cacciaguida is going to be really clear, and there's going to be no room for anything that's too specific. This has to be a language that's broad enough for everybody to understand. So Cacciaguida is giving the prophecy, the final prophecy, the most important prophecy of Dante's exile. The language has to be of the broadest appeal, and there is a marked
absence of hapax immediately after he uses ambages, ambaje. I'm trying to think of other examples. There's also in Inferno 22. I mean, this is going to sound like I'm evading your question because it's the canto with the most hapax in the whole poem, but the way they are distributed is quite interesting, and they're kind of used as a way to, as a kind of, the way they're spread between dialogue, the dialogue of the anonymous Navarrese and the indirect discourse. They are rarely in dialogue. So there's something, it's kind of the opposite. There's a kind of breadth and broad appeal that the Navarrese is trying to establish without using hapax in his dialogue. And then that, when he gets closer to dying or being skewered again, and the stakes are risen, the stakes are raised, then the hapax come back almost, but as instinctive.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have a question now from Selena Vandy. Selena, do you want to turn on your camera? And
Hi. Hi, everyone. Hi, George. Thank you very much for Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. I was wondering, this is a very biased question, if you've treated Dante's own neologisms in the Paradiso in your dissertation, in your work on hapax.
Yes. I don't know. I kind of actually sort of expected that question from somebody because I didn't mention it at all, which is kind of, now I think about it, maybe a bit of an oversight. But yeah, so I have thought about it, and so I found that what was most interesting to me was that I think it's often they're very tricky to write about. I think sometimes it's very easy to slip into an easy kind of association of simple elevation of tone, right? That this is a marker of I guess, raising the stakes. And in a way that is true, but also I think something that is often forgotten is that the neologisms, so for those unaware, this is things like inluiarsi, inniarsi, reflexive verbs that mean to, in him, in you, oneself. Yeah, it's full of them. They're comprised of very simple components of language. They're actually extremely simple to parse. You really need a kind of relatively simple knowledge of Italian to understand what's going on. They're not. This is not a difficult thing to. This is an instinctive. This is almost an instinctive thing that you can grasp. So I think sometimes neologisms need to be contextualized in this way. Also, I think I don't tend to use the term neologism often, only because sometimes there have been, and Ronald Martinez has done some work, as people will no doubt know, has kind of shown that there's a large kind of Provençal Occitan heritage to these words. So I'm thinking Arnaud Daniel uses the word onongla, if I'm probably saying it wrong, but to embed in the fingernail. So there's a heritage to it. So again, this is why I kind of want to complicate certain things that are said about neologisms. But no, I'm sorry, I didn't talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's see the first one.
Oh my God.
Here we go. This is what I like to see.
Seriously?
Okay, I'm not sure if my question makes sense, but I will try. What do you think is the relationship, if there's any? You mentioned the Sermo Humilis between hapax and, let's say, the poetics of Sermo Humilis. Because if I got it, like sometimes these hapax look like they're difficult words that they give like some weight to and like they attract the attention of the reader in a way. But in some other cases, like merda or other words you were mentioning, they're not hard words, they're very popular words in a way. So yeah, I wanted to, like, if you had any thoughts about the relationship between the hapax and the poetics of Sermo Humilis.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think one thing, thank you. One thing that is important is not to take the poet's own words
too literally as well. So that's another layer of complication. So the word Commedia, for instance, is what he uses to describe his own poem. And there's when he reflects on his own poetic style elsewhere, it's kind of important to, I think, make a distinction between what we're reading and what Dante says, and to remember that there's a layer of fictivity. However, so I think it's more, this is why I wanted to kind of establish this kind of word choice and hapax as a methodology more than a case-by-case basis, because it's as sermo humanis is, and that's, you could maybe say it's a similar kind of term to plurilingualism. I don't know, sort of kind of both ways of conceptualizing the ideology of language in the poem. In the one sense, yes, it means that there is a generosity there, but I think that a generosity to various levels of style, which I think is what allows. So it's not the same thing. The sermo humanis allows plurilingualism to function, the plurilingualism to function, because it allows an open-endedness of a stylistic open-endedness. But you're right to point out that there's kind of contradictions within that, and I think that's also important. I think it's kind of showing that through the poem we can think about the poem through the poem as well, but also remembering to kind of keep a kind of wary eye on kind of not taking things too literally. But I think we can use the poem. We can use the hapax. We can use it to kind of expose precisely what the ideology, the linguistic ideology of the poem is. Does that kind of answer your question? Not really.
I'm delighted to welcome back to Cork Isa Kitson and Schute.
I'm not giving a presentation.
I'm not welcome. I'm not welcoming this.
I'm sure you're not welcoming this. But you cannot. Can you? Well, the question is about scratching. Do you mind talking about scratching for a while?
Yeah.
No, because I was just thinking about Infra 29 and sort of other forms of useless labor, and it's called protesta labor, scratching that happens. And awesome. So the delight that's involved in this kind of useless labor, which also happens in Inferno, so there's no end to it really, or no purpose, well, no useful purpose to it. And
yeah.
So I was also, Benvenuto is someone who talks about it as in terms of delight, and he talks about it in terms of, it seems delightful to the itchy man to scratch. Therefore, he desires for himself an indestructible instrument with which he can always delight, as if to say, if God always gives you something to work with.
That's brilliant.
Can you talk about the delightful aspect of scratching?
Thank you, Esther. Yes, that's a brilliant question. Because I mean, I'm imagining that what you're maybe driving at is scratching as a kind of graphic, a kind of a representation of writing.
Well, there's also hapax as well. Hapax.
Yeah. Yes.
And also different sort of similes that he's using to describe. So it's a lot like hitting a fish with a knife, and so
yeah.
Boy, that's
yeah.
Also,
yes.
Let's repeat that.
Oh yeah. So Isa pointed out that there's lots of different similes, kind of hapax on hapax, complexity on complexity, different forms of useless labor in Inferno 29. Okay. So I think one thing that immediately springs to mind is the hapax vergare, which is now in Paradiso 12, I think. This is really testing me. Which is kind of a way of lining a paper. So when you talk about scratching, to me, I'm thinking of writing. I'm thinking of the development of kind of doodling in Inferno, a kind of like a variety of different kind of ways of scratching and scraping, as you said, scales off of a kind of a disconnected kind of poetic methodology to something more refined, the Vergare of Paradiso. That's what I would immediately respond with. Scratching as well, that, to bring it back to what Elsina asked, Auerbach actually does talk about a hapax. It's romnia, also in Paradiso 17, which is itch. So, yeah. This is Cacciaguida. So I think you've hit on something that is another kind of filigree to run throughout the poem. Kenneth's got a question. Yeah, I think you've hit on something that is kind of another kind of metapoetic thing around which you can kind of crystallize an argument.
So we'll pass over to the friend of the centre there, Kenneth Clark. Hi, Kenneth.
Greetings. Can you hear me? All right. I have a question kind of about what even is a hapax in the first place, and how do you know you've seen one? That is to say, you've built into this idea of the hapax, this notion of pleasure, this idea of kind of the enjoyment of the poem, the enjoyment of reading the poem as a reader, and the sort of luxuriating maybe in the hapax. And I think that's right. I think there is a great pleasure in that. But I'm wondering a bit how, and we've talked about this before, this isn't a, how you, in a way, you can never define a hapax until the poem is over, because there's always a chance it'll be used again. So you never know it's a hapax in the moment of the reading. It doesn't have a status as hapax. That it only develops a status retrospectively when you're finished the poem, and when the last line, when the last word is done. So to what extent is the hapax also a kind of a belated phenomenon that you only ever find out after the fact?
Yes, brilliant question, Kenneth. Thank you. Yes, I agree, and it kind of there's a kind of as well. There's a kind of pun there on what sort of there's a kind of, you have to have a completion of reading. It's a kind of you have to kind of complete the circle. That there's and so singularity can mean two things or more things. Singularity can mean separation, something disparate, or it can mean unification. And so I think there's a kind of a comprehensive nature of the reading that you have to do. And also, naturally, if you're going from as many critics have done, of reading into the importance of rhyme as the kind of fulcrum of the line, and that's obviously going from back to front. That's starting from that end of the line, the kind of the non-linear sense going back. I'm thinking also of Agamben's The End of the Poem, the kind of the creative impulse resides at the end of a poem, resides at the end of the line. So yes, I think you're completely right.
Well, the hapax is sort of an invitation to reread, I suppose.
Yes,
that actually that there's no that when you finish the poem you have to reread it.
And that's also why it's so interesting to think about it with rime equivoque, because I mean there's actually a sort of cross canto rime equivoque where, or I'm thinking of the word collare, which is included by Hollander in his index of hapax, but it means both times, but it means two, and that's not the only example, but it means two different things. So there's a kind of okay, so is it the kind of then you get into a whole linguistic thing about what is a word, then it's and then it kind of unravels, and is it just or maybe we can make a distinction between morphological hapax and semantic ones. Yes.
Okay. All right. So it was funny, and I'm really glad you brought up the example of it from the De Vulgata Venezia when Dante, doesn't want to see the use of mamma and babbo. We were treated over the last few days to meeting mamma and babbo of George, and it really does explain a lot when you meet George's parents. They're lovely, lovely people, and they produced a very unique son, let's say. Now, before we thank George one last time, I just want to kind of thank a few people and organizations. First, I want to thank Leonardo de Oliveira, who basically ran all of the kind of logistics of our Dante lecture series. She works behind the scenes, and she is the one who's in contact with all these people, making travel arrangements, eating arrangements, making sure everyone is okay. And so thank you, Leonor. Your help in this series is immense, so thank you. I also want to thank all my colleagues in the Department of Italian for their continuing support. This is our 15th year, so you can't do what we do for 15 years without the support of your colleagues, and so I want to thank them. I also want to thank CASILAC, that is our Centre for Advanced Studies in Languages and Cultures. While the name still exists, I want to thank them for their financial support, which is obviously important because we need money to be able to do these things. It took a lot of money to get George over from the O'Reilly building to the council room, as you can see. So no expense spared there. A big thank you to all of our group in the CDSI, the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland. Yes, a big thank you especially to those online, Federica Coluzzi and Valentina Mele, Dario Galassini, obviously, but here in the room I also want to thank Alcina Caponetti, Chiara Valcelli, who's been working the Zoom for us, Elisa Rosati, who next year is going to ask a question, and a very special welcome back to Isa Kiltonovicute, who made it across the waters for tonight's lecture. We're delighted to see Isa with us tonight, and I really do consider myself genuinely lucky to collaborate and work with all of them, such as their energy, their drive, and their enthusiasm. So a big thank you to all of them. A special thanks also to you, our audience. I will admit that during the COVID years, we lost the vast majority of our audience, and I didn't think we'd kind of get them back when we tried different experiments and hybrid forms. But when we did, what ended up happening is that we built a new audience, both an online one and an ever-increasing one that comes into the room. So I think moving over here to the council room has also been beneficial in that regard. So I'm delighted to see so many familiar faces and so many new ones as well. So hopefully we can continue this into next year. So rest assured there will be a lecture series next year. But as you can see, our winter lecture series really brings us into what I would call the beginning of spring. You saw it today when we came into the room for 6 o'clock and the sun was shining and it was still all very nice. Lastly, I want to thank our 5 speakers, who I think gives quite a unique series, from Professor Stephen Milner on industrial Dante. It seems so long ago now, but that was a brilliant way to kind of kick off the series. Next, we had the indomitable Professor Zygmunt Baranski, who gave us a real tour de force on the structures of Dante's Commedia. And then we had, fittingly, Dr. Gaia Tomazzoli, and she was kind of a perfect guide to navigate us through this kind of digital aftermath of Dante and Dante's studies. And I think it was really, really something that many of us needed to see. And lastly, last week we were bequeathed a very compelling, invigorating, wonderfully unique lecture stroke performance by Professor Kimberly Camponella, whose versioning of Dante also had that title, Descending into Detail. But I think what we did this evening with George was really descend into the actual detail of Dante's Commedia. And I think you agree with me, this was a quite brilliant way to finish off the series. This was a quite brilliant lecture. I think the passion with which he talks about these things, the intellectual engagement with which he goes into that text, and from what he's able to draw from it, it really is something that is very admirable and one of the kind of rising stars, I believe, in Dante studies. So please join me in thanking George for a brilliant lecture. And we will see you next year. Nope.